Okay. Before we get going on a discussion of the regulation and stuff this week, um, I do want to touch on a couple of things just generally for class business. First off, I don't know if y'all have seen, but I've uploaded a few more weeks worth of modules to Canvas. You don't have to worry about them. The reason I'm mentioning that is over this weekend and then probably the following weekend, I will be working on Canvas and uploading even more stuff to those modules and kind of fleshing out the course some more. Um, I want to just tell y'all this because I know some of y'all get like crazy tons of Canvas notifications. And I also want to tell you, if you would like to, feel free to turn your Canvas notifications for this class to like once a day or once a week, so you get like a little single digest style message. Um, Not that after the next couple of weeks I'm going to be uploading like crazy or anything, but I will never ever send you anything that I'm like, hey, this is due in 2 hours, and expect you to have it done. Okay, so you don't have to really stay on top of stuff. Um, if you like having stuff sent to you constantly, so you know that things are available to you, feel free to keep it that way. But no, you can largely ignore the upload stuff because I try to have it enough in advance. Um, I've gotten at least one submission that I saw earlier today to the voice thread for this week. I did want to talk about that very briefly. Um, the idea behind this is really simple. We talked about it a little bit last week, but for this week's assignment, what we're doing is going archive digging. And this is going to just kind of slowly build toward us being able to do our final projects, which I'll post details on by Friday. Just like I said in the syllabus, by the end of the third week, you'll have details on exactly what the final project is going to be. Um, but what you're going to do is go into archives that the library has access to, so you don't really have to go anywhere and find anything. You just have to go to the library's website and use the databases that I told you about. There's a video on VoiceThread this week that right up front, it's like 20 to 25 minutes. I forget exactly how long. Some of it's a little rambly, but it is me telling you kind of exactly how you can go in and use those databases and kind of how to search and where to search for certain types of stuff. The first half of it, as I mentioned last week, is more towards TV materials. And the second half is more towards radio. So you'll want to pay particular attention to the radio stuff for this week's assignment. The idea is that I want y'all to go and explore in the archive. And I don't want you to just dig around and find one thing or, whatever, and just submit the first thing you find. I want you to just get a feel for it a little bit. Find something that genuinely interests you about a topic that we've either talked about in our sessions or that has come up in the book that you want to know more about. And really just dig into it. You can center it if it's easier for you to kind of figure out how all of this works. You can center it around some of the stuff we've listened to this week. So, my media object that I put in there is about the shadow, and if you go and watch that, it's the first slide, and play my comments, I walk you through kind of why I found it interesting and why I put it up there and kind of the ways that it intersects with class. That's literally all I'm asking you to do. Okay. So just take this opportunity to get in there. I think archive digging is fun, but you have to familiarize yourself with it. And they all take different skill sets to navigate. Like some of them are just you can do word searches, but they're not super thorough, and you're just kind of clicking through to see what's there, which is actually really fun because you get to see all kinds of ads for products and stuff like that that you can also bring in and talk about. Um, so just play around, okay? This first assignment is just getting our feet wet and seeing what we can dig up, okay? To that end, I did want to do a screen share with you real quick. Okay. Um, just because I didn't show this, I don't think I show this in the intro video on that voice thread either. So if we go down to this week, Click on the voice thread and open it up. Once it takes you there, okay, this is week 3 voice thread assignment. Where you'll want to click, everybody can see, I hope, is right here where it says edit. And then you'll come in, you'll hit add media, upload a screenshot or a PDF or however you want to upload it. And then go back to the voice thread. And then on your slide, and Jacob, you put it on mine, it's okay, it doesn't matter. On your slide, just come down to the wheel and add your comment, okay? Just like you would on a normal voice thread. Are there any questions about that or how to do it? Okay. I think this type of thing is really fun because it's a little more interactive for y'all as opposed to just doing like discussion board posts or trying to respond to like quiz prompts or other things like that. And also it does, like I said, the goal is that it will help build toward your final project for the class, okay? Like the skills that you're developing during these voice threads. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to mention is that I will also this week put up information about the over 50 interviews that we'll be doing for the class. So y'all can do those at any time up until they're due and submit them, and I'll grade them as they come in. It's a fun assignment. You might want to wait slightly later in the semester just so, you know, if you're talking to a parent or a grandparent about television in the 60s or 70s or early 80s or something, you might want to wait until we get around that period so that you have something to go back and forth with them about. But, you know, if you're interviewing somebody in their 90s about radio in the 1930s, you know, feel free. But those will also be up on Friday. That way, you know, there's, at least for our big assignments, everything's out on the table. You can look at them, ask questions, start thinking about ideas, and we'll go from there. Okay? All right. So let's move into kind of our full discussion for the week and talk a little bit about kind of how radio regulation starts to form in the 1920s and 30s and what kind of some of the consequences and developments thereof are. So the big two things that happen, there's the Radio Act of 1927 and then the Communications Act of 1934. And the book actually does a really good job of breaking down kind of the importance, especially of the 1927 legislation. But what I find interesting, and I want to make sure that y'all really understand, is that these two pieces of legislation by the US government kind of solidify a very unique situation for United States broadcasting rights, systems, and kind of the development of how radio and television actually exist in this country, which is, hopefully you got a sense of this from your reading, quite different from almost every other country, right? Did y'all get that sense a little bit? So most countries up until the 90s and the 2000s had kind of a public funded model for television, and almost all of their TV was funded through public payment. Okay, so in the UK, for example, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, is officially a government entity that receives its money to make its programs from the government. So the budget is set by the actual United Kingdom government itself, right? The way they get that money is through licenses. So if you have a radio in your home, if you have a television in your home, they charge you an annual license fee to be able to have that television and access the broadcasts. Okay. They're you might think like, oh, well, how are they keeping track of that? Well, one of the ways they used to do it, starting in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they continued for a long time, they still do it to this day for a certain extent, although everything being digital kind of nullifies the need for this, is they would literally just take vans around that would have antenna on them so that they could track which homes are receiving signals and see if that home had actually paid for a TV or radio license that year, and then find them if they hadn't. Um, the idea being that because, and we'll talk about this in the US context in just a minute, because they defined kind of the um, broadcasting as a public service or public good in a very specific way, they felt that the government was going to be the most efficient means by which public needs were actually met. Okay. In the US, what happened was that corporations had been developing technology. They had spent a lot of money on research and development. And even though the government kind of maintained control of the airwaves, right? We own, the public, the citizens of the US, by US law, own the airwaves for radio and television broadcasting. But the way that the system works, and I think the book is pretty clear at laying this out, is that the government licenses usage to private companies that then operate networks and make programs to put on the airwaves. Okay. And the way that that system is funded is through advertising, sponsorship, and private equity. Okay. So the big thing that the Radioactive 27 really does is that it kind of solidifies what the author of the book, Michelle Hilms, and other scholars of this period call the progressive compromise. So, what is this compromise exactly? Do y'all remember what they mean by progressive compromise?
I think it was a way to make sure that the radio serves for like the public and public interest,
Okay.
basically.
Why is that important for the US government relative to private interests controlling programming? Like if we own the airwaves and we're giving the networks a license to make content and broadcast content for free, effectively, as long as they uphold their end of the bargain, which is that they function in some capacity towards educational and or public service, right? Why is that an important thing in the United States in this period, do you think? Some of this ties back into the stuff we talked about last week as well. Any ideas?
It made sure that certain agendas were being pushed to the forefront in front of others.
Okay. Um, what were they scared of being pushed to the forefront, or what types of things were seen as not necessarily in the public interest? Do y'all remember? Yeah, Kaylee just put out propaganda stations, right? So there was that doctor that was pushing things about calves livers and stuff, right? Wildly popular program, as an example. Okay, so trying to regulate who was able to broadcast and what types of things they were able to broadcast becomes kind of a central concern for the US government. And that's what a lot of the 1927 Act kind of codifies into law. The idea that there's going to be a regulatory organization, then called the Federal Radio Commission, but then in 1934, the FCC is what it turns into, the Federal Communications Commission. And the idea was that this body was going to give out and license rights for the airwaves to these stations and networks, and that they were going to be in charge of, to some extent, regulating the type of content that you could use and put out onto those airwaves. Okay. Now, we kind of just hit on this, but all of this is tied up in this ongoing debate that lasts really until the early 1930s about what in the heck anybody actually means by public interest. And there's two different kind of strategies here that people want to pursue, or two types of arguments. So argument one is that the public interest is simply anything that the public is interested in. What are some potential problems with that viewpoint? Any thoughts? Potential problems with anything the public is interested in being the thing that counts as producing content in the public interest?
The things that the public might be interested in might not be what the government wants to push as the ideal for Americans.
Okay. Yeah, right. And so all of this is also tied into those ongoing struggles that the US government finds itself in against nefarious actors like jazz musicians, but as well as at the time politically, like the growth of communism in Eastern Europe, right? And so there's this kind of struggle, this back and forth where they want to be really careful that just outright charlatans and propagandists cannot, just say whatever they want over the airwaves that the government owns and controls, right? The flip side of this is to think about the public interest as being something that is meant to produce and be for the good of the general public, right? So this is kind of the idea that sets up eventually in another chapter or two, the foundations for what eventually becomes PBS, the public broadcasting system, right? The idea that stations, if they are going to have this license and be given the right to broadcast, can't just define public interest as whatever programming is the most popular and therefore makes them the most money on ad revenue, right? But instead has to be a combination of educational programming as well as news programming on some level. And this came beginning in the early 30s with some concession to the idea that if, for example, a national emergency is going to occur, the government has the right to interject and supersede all other broadcasts across the broadcast spectrum in order to reach the largest amount of people possible and to address the situation that is occurring. But beyond that, the networks had to demonstrate a commitment to this kind of public service model. And most of the ways they did that was by either producing educational programming and airing it themselves, or to offer some form of news programming. Eventually, by the early 40s, this was more common. One of the problems that kind of develops out of this is that in order to think about public interest in this way, the government has to start defining what they mean by quality programming and quality use of the airwaves. And this turns into a whole other part of this debate, which leads to kind of preferential treatment. Because one of the things they decide is that, okay, if we're going to privilege people and stations and networks, because there's tons and tons and tons of upstarts and people who want to start networks and who want licenses, but they're trying to keep it small. We're talking in the hundreds of stations at this point, okay? Who do we decide who to give licenses to, right? Who gets them? So one of the ways they think about this is the quality of the technology and the service that that company is capable of. Okay. Which means that those companies that have a lot of money, that already have established stations in various cities, right, are privileged in the licensing agreements that come about, and that it becomes harder and harder if you're an upstart or an independent to obtain a federal radio and eventually television license. What are the potential problems that you can already tell, knowing what you probably know about broadcast television already, that might arise from this preferential treatment moving forward if we're locking out upstarts and independents for no real reason other than, you know, their tech isn't as good yet? What kind of system does that end up creating on some level? Monopolization, Nazario puts in there, okay? So you start to see by the 30s those familiar names: NBC, CBS, ABC, right? Those are the big radio networks. And they stay that way until, well, I mean, they're still the major networks. They're not as big radio wise. Clear Channel, which is another big corporation, has, you know, bought up a ton of stuff now. But NBC, ABC, CBS are still the major networks, right? And then eventually Fox, but that's not until the mid 80s. So it creates this monopoly system, which leads to its own problems, right? Okay, I want to throw this to y'all. Okay. What does the 1934 Communications Act do that the 27 Communications Act doesn't directly address? There's some clue to this on page 73 in the book, kind of in the, let's see, in the first paragraph up there. It kind of lays out a list of things that the FCC kind of takes a look at and starts considering. So what are some of the problems that start to rear its head that the FCC is now going to address formally as a part of the 1934 Communications Act? We're talking about content regulation, right? Things like obscenity, right? We'll go through the list here, right? Guidelines and suggestions for responsible broadcasting, right? Medical quackery, right? You're going to quickly see over the next kind of 2 weeks or so how many of these regulations we've gotten rid of if you watch TV now, right? Like under this guideline from 1934, Dr. Oz would not be on the air. He would not have a show. He would not be allowed to be on the air. So medical quackery, astrology, and fortune telling. There goes your ghost hunting shows and paranormal TV shows, right? Contraceptive advertising. Can't get condoms or pills, anybody. Favorable references to hard liquor. Well, Seagram's actually ends up buying out media companies later in the 20th century. So, you know, that goes by the wayside. Racial or religious defamation. This one always worked around because we always privilege certain groups over others. Obscenity and indecency. This kind of becomes the big one that you hear about fines all the time for, even today. Excessive violence, playing of recorded music, on-air solicitation of funds. One of the big things outside of just the content that was being regulated was also how these networks were going to make money. Okay. And this also goes back to the idea of the public interest and what that means. All right. So let me turn my page. Sorry. What happens kind of very quickly at the end of the 1920s, due in part to the Great Depression, is that the government has to start dealing with a whole lot of other things, right? Radio at this point is still relatively minor. And because they have the capital to kind of operate in and of themselves, by 1934, they were able to argue successfully that they were capable of producing content that addressed the government's concerns, as well as provided, because this is always the argument for private industry, space for innovation and progress, right? That they were best able to deliver this. The government, you have other things to get a handle on, right? The crashing economy, the fact that nobody can buy a house. And so the government says, yeah, okay, take it off our hands, essentially. This leads to kind of several different stages of production for the radio. So the big one that NBC had, and your book talks about this and kind of brings back Bertha Brainerd a little bit, because she was kind of their big network programmer, if you remember. The way that NBC's model worked for producing programming and putting it on the air was that the network's programmers would set a schedule, and they would create programs that the sponsors paid them for. Okay, so they'd create the idea for the program, kind of package it, pitch it to a sponsor. If the sponsor was into it, they would pay the network for them to produce it, and they would get kind of ad bumps at the beginning and end of the program. All right. And in the middle, which y'all, I know, got in the Shadow episode this week, right? For Blue Coal. Okay. What happens to kind of change this and then becomes the standard model for a little while is that in the 1930s, particularly like 1934, 1935, the ad industry, the advertising industry, starts to come into its own and start to resemble something that we might think of as familiar to ourselves today. It's not quite, the Mad Men era. If you've seen that show, it's not quite that level of competency yet and conniving, but it is this big thing that starts to make corporations lots and lots more money than they were making just by, having wide distribution, maybe occasionally paying for an ad spot. And what happens is the advertisers start to take over programming a little bit. And the way this happens is they work with the sponsors, the potential brands that want to sponsor programs, on what types of programs they would like to create. And they put the money in to produce them with the sponsor. Okay. And then they turn around and sell that show to the network. Okay. For the ad industry, and why they're very particular and interested in this model, is basically they were taking a 10% to 15% commission from the sponsor, okay, to work for them and come up with an ad campaign and then a program that they could sell to the radio. And then when they turned around and actually sold that to the radio network, they would get paid another 10% fee for brokering that deal. So they were ending up making 20 to 30% of whatever the sponsor was putting out was going directly to the ad company, the ad agency. Okay. So, as a consequence of kind of the sponsorship model, the next thing that advertising agencies and networks start to realize is that if they could get established stars, people who were already known in Hollywood, right, to come on their show, or if they could license a property from Hollywood, right? So in the 40s, this becomes a big thing too, where like we're going to have Humphrey Bogart doing Casablanca on the radio. and there's tons and tons and tons of instances of this, but even just having them come in and do a guest spot on a variety show would guarantee that there was a bigger audience, which means that the network would get paid more to put it on the air. They could charge more for it because the space was worth more, and that the sponsors potentially made more money based on the increased eyeballs watching that episode or listening to it at this point. So this is the idea behind the sponsor model, and then what eventually becomes kind of the guest star model of production for all these variety shows, which, you know, the ones you're probably familiar with today are like late night talk shows and Saturday Night Live. But the idea is that it increases ears and eventually eyeballs, which in turn means that the sponsor or the advertiser is reaching more people, which eventually, in theory, will trickle into different sales for their products. Okay, does this make sense to everybody? Why they'd be interested in doing this? Okay. But all of it's driven by ad agencies who are making money coming and going on both sides of this. Okay. Now, in a few weeks, we'll talk about how the networks take control over programming and some of the reasons why. But the US government is actually really okay with this sponsor model because it means that the networks are not necessarily in charge of deciding fully what makes it on the air. And the reason they're okay with that is because the big fear that's driving a lot of this regulation is that the networks are going to, and they certainly do, subvert their side of the contract for that license and not actually emphasize educational or public interest programming, and instead only put stuff on the air that will make them the maximum amount of money. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? So this is kind of where we end up by the time the shows we listen to this week are airing. Okay. So I want to open up now for like a general discussion of the shows and get your impressions of them and kind of your thoughts. How do y'all want to start? You want to talk about War of the Worlds, Shadow, Witch's Tale? Where you want to go? This is the participation point. I'll sing more to you if you want. I'm an okay singer. I'm not great though, so you don't want it to be too long.
I wanted to say something about like not a specific show, but
Yeah.
something in general that caught my attention was the usage of sound. Like they were really good at how they use the sound, which it seems weird to be like saying that caught my attention because that's what they're doing that because it's radio, but we don't do it as much nowadays. So it was kind of more interesting for me to kind of hear that and be able to like hear the different pitches in people's voices. And I think in The Witch, you could like hear that the female was farther away from the males that were talking, and that kind of like spatial sense that you can get from how they were manipulating the sound was something I found really, really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually really sophisticated sound design. You know, that you're not thinking about. One, because like Hollywood movies at this time had just gotten soundtracks, right? And they're still figuring this out. But over on radio, because they're not tied down to like a camera that can't move or anything like that, or like microphones that can't move away from the body, they can do a lot more with what they're doing. You can like visualize almost a three-dimensional space for what they're doing. So yeah, they're quite good. I also find it interesting, you know, I don't know how many scripted or whatever podcasts y'all listen to these days, but given the proliferation of that in as a form of podcasting, I always find it interesting to go back and listen to these old time radio shows which is how they're designated. They're called old time radio, OTR, if you look them up on the internet. And see kind of how different that sound design really is, as you pointed out. It goes far beyond just the 3 dimensions of space, but like, simple things like, there's footsteps as people are walking to and from places, which I don't notice a whole lot in any of the podcasts I listen to. There might be background music or background noise or certain different sound effects, but the attention or the detail-oriented attention to that spatial element isn't necessarily there, right? Like making a whole picture of it. Not for all of them. There are a few, I think, that do this okay, but it's certainly different, I think, for sure. Well, let's talk about The Witch's Tale a little bit. What'd y'all think of this, creepy old radio show? It was the first horror show that had been broadcast, and it kind of is right there at the birth of modern horror media. So, the show starts in 1932-ish, is its first broadcast. 1931, of course, was like really the foundational year for the American horror film, with like the Universal monster movies and things like that. And Todd Browning's Freaks around that same period. So it's kind of right in that mode, and there's an obsession with all things macabre and witchy and vampire oriented at this time. So what'd y'all think of the show?
I thought it was really good.
Sorry, who was that? So first, I know that Catherine, and then there's somebody else. Was it Jonah, maybe?
Yep.
Okay, go ahead, Jonah, and then we'll get to Catherine.
All right, sounds good. I was just gonna say, I thought it was really great in sense of just completely being like narrative driven, creating like that sense of scariness. Kind of going off the last point as well, I was really impressed by all of these, how they're able to create like a sense of place just through their narration. Like I was picturing if I was listening to this in the 30s, like from South Dakota, just trying to understand like what the bayou was like. And like they did like a really good job of just like translating that information without actually like having a narrator or being like, oh, the swamp, just through like the characters themselves and their conversation.
Yeah, I was struck by that too. I always show like different episodes every year I teach this class, so I hadn't listened to this one in a while. And yeah, I was struck by like how they constantly are talking about, the mist from the ground and the gravestones and things like that, even once they actually get to the haunted mansion, right? But yeah, I think that's right. And it's certainly, it happens in the shadow as well, and certainly in War of the Worlds, although that's a little more mixed storytelling style, that they're very good at providing information without just giving you blocks and blocks and blocks of, omniscient narrator. They really are thinking about this as kind of a play. Let's see. Liza says, I thought it was interesting that the show was set up almost like a play with an intermission scene changes, etc. One interesting thing we haven't talked about, and the Witch's Tale in particular is like this. The Shadow is a 30-minute program, but the Witch's Tale was a 15-minute show. And so even though what we listened to was 30 minutes, right? Hopefully you got the info like, oh, come back later in the week. It usually air like Tuesday and Thursday or Monday and Wednesday, depending on what the station was airing. And it was a 2-parter, right? So cliffhanger, come back and listen. But the Shadow would play a whole episode. It'd be like 30 minutes. But yeah, other thoughts? Let's see. Oh, I missed something by Kaylin here. I think the change in sound design, I'm getting to you, Catherine. Give me 1 second. I think the change in the sound design comes with a change in public interest and what we want to hear out of a radio show today, or what we would go to podcast to listen to. That's an interesting idea. Catherine, go ahead with what you were going to chime in with.
I was gonna just say something similar about how in lieu of like the visual cues and like making it scary that way, there were they were kind of describing their surroundings in a way that's maybe not natural to like normal conversation, just
Right.
to like give the listener a sense of what what to picture in their mind, and also like the music and the transitions to cue a change in scenery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can see even with just the programs that we listened to this week, kind of a solidifying formula for this, right? Like certain types of things will be reiterated when you come back from a break. Certain types of things will, serve as cliffhangers for the next episode or the second half of the episode. And the sponsor, right, plays kind of a central role um, in how all of that is framed because of kind of the intro, intermission, final statement style of all of this. So it remains pretty similar throughout. I mean, if you watch a a broadcast network show today that airs normally in commercials, right? Um, how many of y'all in here watch Friends? Probably a fair amount, right? Or have seen it, right? Or any show from, you know, before 2 years ago or 3 years ago. All of those shows, when you're watching them on a streaming service, right, have these weird moments where you can tell there was a commercial, right? Because it will, one, yes, maybe it'll fade out, but usually it will be, they'll end on a line of dialogue or something happening. And then the next thing is just them saying that line of dialogue again or slightly rephrasing it in some way. And that's to keep viewers, right, who might have missed that or forgotten what was going on because they just watched 3 minutes of commercials, to get them back into that. And you see that already solidified in the formulas that they're using for these shows we listened to this week, right? How they're thinking about commercial breaks and how to remind people efficiently of information as they're going along. Got some more in the comments here. Sarah says, I felt like it combined the realism or experience of a TV show with the narrative style and dramatics of theater. Yeah, I think, this is, again, not quite TV, so we haven't gotten to the visual component of it yet. So they are thinking about, especially at this time, kind of exactly how the theater would do it, right? So if you've ever seen a production of like Our Town, y'all know that play where it's like the whole set is just like lines on the stage, or maybe there's a box or something, right? And the only way you ever know what anything is somebody talks about it and says, oh, this is the schoolhouse or this is the courthouse or whatever, right? And they just address it that way. Allison thought it was kind of funny when they were over describing what they were saying, helped the listener visualize, but such unnatural dialogue. What's funny about this too is that you can also see this exact type of dialogue in like comic books from the 30s through the 50s, where the people will be talking and over describing stuff that, I mean, it's a comic book, so you can literally just look at what they're talking about and they're just describing it. What's also really funny, but you don't notice it, is that that's most of movie dialogue today, is them describing things that you can just look at. And the reason they're just describing it, and it's more natural dialogue, but they'll constantly work it in, right? Like y'all have seen the movie Inception, right? A lot of you, okay, you're familiar enough, the majority of you. The whole scene where they like explain to Elliot Page's character like how the thing is working when Leonardo DiCaprio has them on the street in Paris or wherever it is, right? You could just watch that happen and understand it. And yet Leonardo DiCaprio is explaining it the entire time that it's happening, right? That's most of your movie dialogue these days, is just explaining the thing that you could watch. So it is more natural in its flow, but at the time, because they're dealing with how the stage would do it, right? Remember, theatricality was also different back in the 30s, right? Let's see. Dialogue's really interesting. This is from Emily. From a modern perspective, I think many would agree that the script for the shows aren't amazing in the way that they tell rather than show what's going on. but it's completely necessary for radio considering there's no visual component and the show has to rely on diegetic sound and dialogue and narration to tell the story. Yeah, for sure. 100%. And there are, like I said, there are podcasts that do this. Does anybody listen to Welcome to Night Vale? Right? The dialogue in there is not like super naturalistic, right? But it does contribute to an overall sense of mood and setting, right? I mean, there's a narrator running the radio station in Welcome to Night Vale who will constantly like, you know, describe the weather and stuff like that before getting into whatever story is being told. But that formula also comes out of this period of radio as well that kind of keeps persisting. Nazario asks if there was any issues with the show being aired, restricted to time of day, or faced kind of difficulties. There were not that many regulatory issues with the show because of its content, because it was horror, but definitely more adult things would air later in the evening, right? The idea at this moment had not coalesced. You'll see it next week in the reading and in the shows that we're talking about. The idea for what primetime programming was supposed to be, which is kind of the block between 7 and 10, had not really coalesced into meaning family time. So The Witch's Tale would air usually later in the day or in the evening, but it was targeted towards adult audiences. The way all of this was really handled was much more like how Hollywood would handle stuff at this time, where they kind of conceived of everything as as having the possibility of everyone in the family watching the movie, and therefore it would never get too out of hand, right? So that the show would be creepy, but they're not going to describe the vampire sucking the blood out of somebody's neck, right? Because that would be too gruesome. So that was kind of how it was handled.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other thoughts on Witch's Tale? I'm real anxious to talk to y'all about the Shadow and stuff, but well, let's move on to the Shadow. The Shadow was a huge radio program. It's based on a series of pulp adventures, right? You'll know what pulp magazines were back in the day. They were called pulp magazines because they were printed on very, very, very cheap paper. But you know, things like Conan the Barbarian was a pulp adventure story, right? So usually it was sci-fi adventure. In the 1920s and 30s, things like The Shadow, The Spider, this kind of pseudo vigilante superhero figure that was very, you know, noirish and extra violent, but had some kind of supernatural element to it, was very in vogue. Had y'all heard of The Shadow before listening to this program? No? There's a not great movie from the 90s called The Shadow with Alec Baldwin in it that I think is on Hulu, if you're interested. It's got the same problem that most of these properties do, which is that anything that was published in those pulp novel or pulp magazines tended to have some form of Orientalism and or just straight up racism in them, because there was usually about like a white dude. You know, if you think about Indiana Jones, right? Indiana Jones is based on pulp adventure stories. That's straight up what it's based on. So you're thinking about like in The Shadow, where his power comes from is that he's this rich white guy who is making amends for his own transgressions by taking the spirit of an ancient Asian philosophical figure into him that gives him supernatural abilities to be able to wreak vengeance against bad people. Okay. I know you probably didn't get that from the episode, but that's what's going on. So what were your thoughts on the Shadow here?
kind of looked at it as like the precursor to a lot of Batman, superhero, Arrow type programming that we have now. So the focus being on the vigilante, who's kind of this anti-hero kind of character. We don't know a lot about him, but it's just a shadowy figure. And it also reminded me of like Sherlock Holmes. So the idea of, oh, you have this main character, they're trying to solve a crime, and then you have this kind of side character who's there. So I think that was kind of the woman in this particular episode when they were like talking it out. So I thought it was interesting to hear that it was so similar to Batman. Like that was the first thing that I thought of. So that was really cool.
Yeah, and the Shadow and the Spider, which was another one of these pulp vigilante heroes, were direct inspirations for Batman. Like down to the fact that he wears a cape, he operates at night, he has sidekicks eventually. And also, if you go and read like the first like dozen or so Batman stories that were in Detective Comics, he uses guns and like shoots people, right? Much like the Spider and the Shadow would do. So it was very much this kind of figure that Bob Kane and Bill Finger had in mind when creating that character, for sure. Liza asked about demographic info. We'll talk about audience measurement next week because it starts to become a big thing. Generally, we just know mostly about these earlier programs. War of the Worlds, we know some about who was actually listening. But these earlier programs, mostly what we know is that they sold a lot to networks, right? So that the stations were airing them a whole lot and regularly, which is indicative of the popularity. Oddly enough, one of the ways that we have any data about early radio listenership and what was actually extremely popular are letter writing campaigns. So if people were interested in a program or hated a program, they would write the station or the network directly and just say that and beg them to like make more episodes or tell them to take this garbage off the air and it's not fit for consumption or whatever else. So not unlike today and how we use social media as some form of user engagement metric, right? Buddy, sorry, my dog just popped in. I'll show him to you in a minute, but he's old. Yeah, thoughts on the Shadow at all? Did it interest you generally, or did you kind of just find it boring, or doesn't matter? All right, well, let's talk about War of the Worlds then. This is a big one. Y'all have heard of this broadcast, right? What have y'all heard about it? What's the big thing everybody knows about the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast that Orson Welles did? Anyone?
It incited nationwide panic over the content of the radio show, and Orson Welles was always tied up in just being like scheming, and like there was always trouble associated with his name regarding his films and his work in general.
Okay, so it's tied up both in like all our assumptions and things we hear about Orson Welles, right, as a director, producer, actor. But the big famous thing, apparently, is that, you know, people were panicking in the streets. They thought that Martians were actually invading the Earth and that the world was going to end, right? There's some truth to this, but the extent of it is, you know, not that great. Listening to the show, it's pretty obvious what's going on if you're listening, right? Like you can tell that there are staged elements. Yes, there are, you know, news broadcast elements to it, but basically by halfway through the show, those elements like disappear entirely, right? And it becomes much more of a straightforward narrative. And, you know, I think the easiest way to think about it in relation to, you know, how much of this is real is in film history, the big myth about early audiences is that, you know, when they saw the Lumiere brothers train coming to the station, that they all like ran out of the tent, right? There's literally no evidence of that actually ever happening. It's kind of this whole thing that, you know, later generations tell themselves to usually make themselves feel smarter than previous crowds and audiences when they were watching their dumb old movies or whatever, right? Kind of this, it ties into our need to look at this all media that we like and that are like relative to our own lifetimes as, you know, the new thing is always better than the old. And weren't these people so stupid for liking this old thing? And here's why they were stupid, right? And so the War of the Worlds broadcast, even though there is an element of some truth to, you know, people briefly thinking that things were, you know, going awry and calling their local stations that were airing the program, that of course we do have some evidence for. It's, you know, kind of this myth that we've created of like, oh, these dumb early radio listeners, weren't they so dumb? We know what's happening now, you know, kind of thing. So what y'all think of this program, how it was put together? Does it live up to the hype of history and what a big deal we make out of it? Feel free to tell me you
Well-
hate stuff. I don't care. Who's going?
Well,
Go ahead, Kaylin.
While I was listening to it, I felt like if you were only half listening to it, or if you were like someone cooking dinner in your kitchen and had it on, you would be like kind of scared about what was happening, because there are times where it's not super clear that it's just like a radio play written by
Right.
someone. So I feel like it kind of did live up to the hype of like inciting panic among people.
Okay. Anybody else agree or have thoughts along those lines? I think it's extremely well put together as a narrative, right? Like the blending of even the news broadcasts, which at the time in 1938 were a relatively new style and form, like the way that Orson Welles is actually using them. That style of news broadcasting was like brand new. But just thinking about it as a text, it's still, I think, pretty effective in how it's constructed. It's kind of this very straightforward, no frills, get to the point element to it. But there is a lot of style as well if you go through, like how he's thinking about, okay, at this moment, we're going to use this type of broadcast element, or we're going to, you know, switch over to now, you know, on the scene, or now we're going to do omniscient narration, or now we're doing character development, that sort of thing. How he's going back and forth and kind of creating this, you know, 40-minute collage, more or less, of different types of radio shows, which I find really interesting because I don't think, again, thinking about how we think about old media, we don't think about them processing what they're doing in this same way, right? It's easy to look at a show like WandaVision and say, oh, they're doing this with this episode and this with this episode, and it's combined in this clever way to tie it all into TV history and the Marvel Universe and all this other stuff. But, you know, this is also what Orson Welles is kind of playing around with this kind of mixed radio program of War of the Worlds. Did y'all hate anything this week? These are also good emotions and thoughts to have, because you can think through, like, why didn't I like something? And those often generate good topics for discussion and, you know, digging deeper into something. Anybody? Okay. Before we go, let me get out of this thing and look at something real quick. Sorry. Just to go over next week, you do have chapter 5 to read in your book. There's also an essay, a separate essay by Michelle Helms called Invisible Men. And the reason I'm assigning that is because the book covers this in both chapter 5 and 6. But what we're going to spend next week partially talking about is kind of the impact and different ways that Amos and Andy were received by Americans listening to the radio show, and much later, like a decade or so, watching the show as adapted for television. So Hilm's essay, she's the same author as the book, that's why I just keep saying the name, but the essay is about that kind of the strange and difficult work of looking at that text within historical context and trying to understand American culture as it develops at this time relative to something that, like Amos and Andy's use of blackface in the radio show and minstrelsy, and how that translates into an actual black cast sitcom in the 1930s or 1940s and 50s on television. Like, what does it mean? How does this text actually function? How is it dealing with issues of race or not dealing with them, right? The whole title of the essay, Invisible Men, kind of points to the fact that, like, there's an erasure of the realities of blackness and black lives at this moment in history in popular culture at a time when these black characters are literally some of the most popular figures in entertainment media. So I do want to just preface that essay and the stuff that we'll be listening to and watching next week as, you know, there's notably offensive content in it. It's not, you know, it's not the worst thing that came out of this period, but, you know, it's definitely filled to the brim with stereotypes. And one of the things that we'll want to talk about is considering, in relation to Hilm's essay and, you know, our own subject positions and those of people at the time, think through the differences in reception for the radio show versus the TV show and what it means to actually have Black people depicted by Black people at this period and how different audiences might think about that differently. Okay. So that's it. I'm going to stop the recording.